Paul Ellison's class yesterday was amazing. He talked about how your hands should look like your hands when you play the bass. I would tell myself that sooner rather than later, to make sure your priorities are right.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we are bringing you a conversation today with Kieran Hanlon, who is the double bass professor at the State University of New York, Fredonia. That's SUNY Fredonia. He's also principal bass at the Erie Philharmonic, and he is an active performer in that part of the country. I ran into Kieran with Alex Hanna. He and Alex were walking by. I was sitting outside at a sidewalk cafe in Ithaca at ISB 2017 in beautiful June weather, such a pleasant place to be. And I'd been meaning to connect with Kieran for the podcast anyway, so we set up a time. We sat down and we chatted, and he has had such a fascinating background. We dig into that. He was actually a violin and jazz bass major, starting out at the University of Michigan. We get into how he deviated from that path and found his path that he's been on ever since. Career paths in general, nuts and bolts of teaching techniques. We talk about teaching for students who've never played the bass, but maybe play a string instrument, people who've never played a string instrument at all. Kieran's got some great takeaways. And before we get rolling here with our conversation with Kieran, I would like to thank so much D'Addario Strings, our longtime sponsor here on the podcast, and one of the major sponsors for ISB 2017 for the upcoming Bass Europe 2018 Congress. They do so much for the bass community, and they're doing another great thing for the bass community with their giveaway of strings. And you can enter to win a chance at getting some strings at contrabassconversations.com/strings. I'm using their Kaplan strings right now. I love them. They're great under the bow. They're great pizzicato strings. They're used by tons of artists, many of whom you've heard on the podcast, like Andres Martin, Klaus Freudenstein, and Mike Valerio. Thanks again for sponsoring the podcast. I totally appreciate it. And I also would like to give a shout out to the Bass Violin Shop, which offers bass rentals. If you're traveling the country, if you're ending up with your group in the Southeast, in the Carolinas, or maybe you're attending a festival or workshop in the Southeastern United States and you need a bass, they're a great place to get a bass. BassViolinShop.com. They will set you up. Check them out, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. Okay, here we go with our conversation with Kieran Hanlon. Where is Fredonia? I know several people that have gone to Fredonia. A buddy of mine, Pete Tambroni, went through there, really? Yeah. And he went into education and just has nothing but great things to say about the place and his experience. Like, where is that in the state?
Fredonia is about halfway between Erie, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo.
Okay,
it's right off of I-90. Right on Lake Erie, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. That I see. I can see it in my mind. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. When did you get the job there or start working there? Like, how did that all happen?
Yeah, I started working at Fredonia as an adjunct. Part time, and I started that right after I finished my master's at Eastman, and I did that for 2 years. And during the second year, they had a full-time search happening for the bass position, and it was national search, and I was very fortunate to be a finalist and then win the job.
Did you see like the university life like that, but that path? I mean, was that something that you'd been thinking about, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had always, I think if you talked to me 6-7 years ago, I had always imagined orchestra job and part-time teaching.
Okay.
Adjunct teaching.
Sure. Right.
That's kind of just what I thought it would be. And it just sort of went the other way.
Yeah.
It went to, full-time teaching and part-time orchestra work.
Right.
And I in the course of my master's sort of just went hands off the wheel a little bit with that stuff, and I applied to what was open, and I started with the adjunct job, and it became clear that it was going to go full-time eventually.
Okay.
And so it was really, I think most importantly, beyond any kind of plans I had 6 years ago, was that once I got there and started teaching college students, I found that I was really at home. I felt really at home, and I really enjoyed working with them. I enjoyed being able just to really relate to them as people. I had done some private teaching of younger students in the past, and Not to say that I didn't enjoy it, but I just felt more at home with the college age.
Yeah. Well, there's this transfer, because like I taught public school for a while, and at the same time I was teaching at DePaul, and with Alexander, like mutual acquaintance. And it was fascinating for me working with people that were like 17 at the high school, and then going like right after that to work with people who are 18, right? It's essentially the same age, right? But all those changes, you like leave home and you're in college, and all of a sudden you're thrown into like the adult world, I guess. Right. And it's just amazing how much that transformation, like by like spring semester of freshman year, they're like, it's like a different, even though the age is so close, it's a different thing for sure.
Yeah, that time of growth I think is really monumental.
Yeah.
And I enjoy, I'm still a rather young person myself, right. And so I feel like one of the privileges I have is to be able to share my recent experience in the music business, trying to find a job with these folks that are just a few years away from that same thing. It's if you're going at it through the college teaching, professional playing route, it's not as automatic as it can be in other careers.
Right. I mean, that finding a job is like the thing that, like, from the time you start music school, there's this sort of like anxiety in the back of your mind or the front of your mind or whatever. Like, what was that finding a job path look like for you? Was it, and you went to Michigan for your undergrad, right? Studied with Diana Gannett.
That's right.
Okay. Yep. Like, were you looking for a master's program? Were you looking for a job? Like, how'd that process look like?
Yeah, well, my Michigan path is a little bit odd.
Okay.
I started out in Michigan, dual degree in violin performance and jazz bass.
Whoa.
And that is one of those things that not a lot of people know for no particular reason. But that's I quickly found my voice as a bassist.
Okay.
And I will say right now that without Diana giving me a shot, because I really never used a bow before, on the bass. So without her giving me a chance to take some lessons and sort of assimilate into the studio a little bit before doing so officially, there's no way I'd be doing what I'm doing right now.
Well,
no
she's
way.
Someone with some vision and like just being able to see like months and years out and like a potential of, I mean, talk about a master of that, like super hard to develop skill.
Yes.
Wow, violin and jazz bass.
Right. So I basically ended up, by the end of my sophomore year, picking up an official classical bass major alongside the jazz bass major. Without Diana giving me that sophomore year to just kind of be in the studio unofficially and just have a chance to learn and get my chops up, and so I'd be ready for an audition. I'm just forever grateful for that. And then later on at Michigan on the classical side, I started having a lot of contact with Stephen Molina, assistant principal in Detroit Symphony, and he was a wonderful influence on me in many ways. Of course, particularly in the orchestral realm, and then all the while, starting freshman year, I had the great privilege to work with Bob Hurst. And so that was the Michigan picture, was just studying with these three legends. And I'm just, so grateful for that. Job search, I mean, that's where this question got started was, I was taking auditions starting, I guess, in my senior year. And, I was at the same time planning to go to grad school, you know, and I ended up going to Eastman and studying with James VanDemark.
Right.
And then also doing the orchestral studies diploma program, which is a playing internship with the Rochester Philharmonic. I had actually already been subbing there a little bit, maybe just once actually. But that 1 week of subbing made it really clear to me that getting some professional experience was going to be not an option, to start heading down the audition road, So I did my master's in that. And again, just sort of along the way, I was doing as much freelance playing as I could possibly do. I was very fortunate to quickly build a private studio. I grew up in Rochester, so moving back there was a good career choice in many ways, and a lot of connections, teaching and playing. And so I was making it work for sure. Coming up to the end of grad school, I was feeling that front of the mind anxiety that you're talking about. Like, well, I'm going to be done with school, and I need to figure something out. And so I started, when I was subbing in Erie, Pennsylvania, in the orchestra there, I met the Harry Jacobson, and Harry was the bass professor at Fredonia, I believe from 1977 until 2 years ago. And he just has a long, like it's very inspiring how long he was able to just hang in and keep doing it, you know. And so Harry, I met him down there, a private student of mine from the Rochester area. I would work with her in the summer. She was a Fredonia student. And so between the two of them, I found out about this adjunct opening. And the college was going through some decisions about how they were going to handle the bass job, whether it was going to go back to full-time or not. So I came on as a part-time adjunct, and then, as I said before, I ended up going for the full-time spot.
It's like a chaotic time, and like there's no like clear path, right? You're just like, see what's available, and I make this connection, and one thing leads to another. And
I think that was an opportunity of growth for me as I think back on it. And I think this is something that music students really need to think about now, is that you got to be pretty open, I think, if you want to really work,
Right.
I mean, I'm a switch hitter player, play jazz and classical, but I would do anything.
Right.
Really,
Right.
That sounds perhaps like a sellout move, but no, and I think you know what I mean.
No, I know totally what you mean. I remember talking to Andy Anderson, who went to Michigan also, though I'm not sure if you overlapped. I don't think so.
No, I know. He's Grant Park?
Yeah, in Grant Park and Lyric Opera. And that was his sort of, I will do anything. I will play for anything. I will take any opportunity. And that's how the doors open.
Yeah.
Violin and jazz bass. And then at the end of that, you are taking orchestra auditions. So like, when did you think, like, so you must have made some sort of switch. You're like, wow, this orchestral bass thing is amazing. I mean, was that freshman year, sophomore year?
Probably. Well, what happened was after my freshman year, Colin Corner had just won the RPO job, the principal's job. And so I was home for the summer teaching private lessons and playing jazz gigs and taking lessons with Colin.
Okay.
And I spent half the summer just getting assaulted by Colin's sound, which is a good thing.
Right.
And just that massive orchestral picture. And I never had heard a bass sound like that before.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. I shouldn't say that because, I think back to growing up as a little guy, and it's actually funny. My dad always tells this story that, I grew up near Rochester, so we'd go hear the Philharmonic all the time. And we'd get seats on the house left, so I could see the violins. And my dad said I was always staring at Bob Zimmerman and Jack Stauber. And I remember one time sitting over on that side of the hall, and Jack Stauber, legendary volume player and musicianship and all this, and just I think it was Beethoven Egmont or something, and just remember just hearing his sound just wash over me. So and I remember remembering that feeling when I was hanging out in Colin's living room and playing bass with him, taking lessons. So I think that really sparked my interest, and I basically shed the seating audition excerpts all summer with Colin. Came back in the fall and was fortunate to get into the upper of the two orchestras at Michigan as a section player, which to me was more of a sign that it was working,
right,
whatever.
Sure.
And then as I did it more, and I played in the orchestra and learned rep, and then got more comfortable on the bass with the bow, things like that, I started to really, really feel like it was something I really loved to do. And that just sort of grew, and then the experiences grew from there. And I kept taking as many lessons as I could with Colin in the summers and Stephen, played for many other people too, and just try to play some catch-up, play with a lot of recordings.
Yeah.
That's something that really I felt was very helpful.
Okay, really?
Yeah, like I would play, like the last hour of my practice in the summers would be I'd turn on Chicago Symphony, Brahms recordings, and just play the whole symphony, And then I think that was a way to sort of play professionally, quote unquote.
Right, kind of get that
not
feeling,
at all, but
right,
exactly. Yeah.
Did you, when you got to Michigan, obviously you're playing violin, so you must be a good violinist to be getting into a place like Michigan. Did you play on the bass with bow at that point, or was it just pizzicato?
I really didn't use the bow.
Okay.
I mean, I had once, a little, but
So what was the transfer? Okay, but obviously you had bow skills because you're playing violin. So how did the violin? Because I've never asked anybody this because nobody's done that exact path.
Kurt Muroki.
Kurt Muroki did too. Actually, I take that back. But not jazz bass. I think just violin. Right. But so how did that violin? What you knew about the bow from the violin world? Like, how did you transfer that over to the bass? What was that process like?
Oh man. Well, I think that the fundamentals of string playing are there,
right?
However you've grown up, and so I actually think it helps me more now than it ever did. I think switching, it doesn't work in a beginning way.
Okay, sure, right.
There is not, I don't think, as much of a
too many differences.
You see this a lot sometimes in perhaps a public school teacher that is not as experienced with low strings. The bass is more bow, and you get whoosh, 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 whoosh.
Right.
They're not. It's not good, right? And so, I think many things, including. I mean, I originally switched to German bow because I felt I was finding that playing violin and then trying to play French bow on the bass.
Too many ingrained habits.
Okay. And they were messing each other up. So I started playing German bow for a while, and that was fine. And then after I sort of stepped away from studying the violin, I did switch to French bow. And that, I think at that point is when violin started to really help me.
Okay.
But there was major differences, like things like rosin, bow speed, flatness of the bow hair, those kinds of things, the way the spiccato worked, And again, I was a very young violinist too. I wouldn't claim to say that I had I played fine, but I don't think I had, like, from an orchestral standpoint, all those different bow strokes. I'm not sure that I had those on the fiddle anyway. So
right.
Yeah, so that's kind of, but in the fundamental way, I just had to really get used to slowing the bow down. There's another transition too with if you're playing a chin instrument, you pull into yourself to get closer to the bridge.
Yeah.
Whereas on the pin instruments, you're
it's
going
the opposite.
You're sort of pushing away from you. So that was a hard habit to break. Every time I wanted more sound, I'd do the like chicken wing thing and pull everything in, and then I'd end up over the fingerboard, and Diana would be frustrated. Understandably.
You do the methods classes at Fredonia as well. Low strings for cello and bass, or just bass?
Just bass.
Okay, but you're getting people coming to the bass. If we just take the string players that are coming to bass in those classes, so the chicken wing and that where you're talking about the pulling in versus the chin versus the pin instruments, which I like that.
Yeah.
Like, what are some other things that string players, like especially violinists and violists, what are some other things that they struggle with when approaching the bass?
Oh, wow. Well, I've actually found that, I'll tell you, the most helpful thing in that class that I've found is to start by saying, let's laugh at each other together.
Okay, yeah.
And then everyone calms down. Those classes can, especially bass, where I think the first step on bass is so huge.
Right.
Just you walk up to a piano, you press the key, and a note comes out.
Yes.
I know someone's going to send me a nasty message on Facebook. I'm not trivializing piano playing. I'm just saying that you can walk up, anyone can walk up and press a key and a note will come out.
Yes.
Whereas on the bass, it's really not that. It's not that automatic in the first place.
Right. I use that analogy all the time as like the default piano, bing, hear that nice clear sound. Okay, not so on bass. Right.
Yeah. So for me, I find that the students have become very frustrated very quickly, especially if they're a very advanced player on a violin, viola, or cello, and they can't even make the bass talk. Then I think that can be very frustrating for students. So I say, we're going to make funny noises for a while. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
So let's just enjoy it and have some fun. So that's the first thing, to just kind of help people just calm down a little bit. But what I've found in terms of transitioning from the upper strings would be the chicken wing arm. This is a little bit harder. This is I wish I could show this with my hands right now. But what happens is when people push an up bow on the bass, I find that they do the raised wrist thing.
Sure.
And like you would on a violin or a viola. I'm doing it right now. I hope everyone can see. and so as the wrist sort of goes towards your chin, I guess, that tends to skew the angle of the bow on the bass.
Yeah.
So the frog is sort of ascending and the tip is dropping as you push the up bow. That's something that's very difficult. I found it's easiest to tell people to follow the bow with their hand. And And that seems to really help with that one. We also work a lot on the bow grip, which is, of course, different from all the upper strings.
Yeah, like how do you get those, like the thing what you were struggling with making that transfer from violin over? Like what are some techniques that and people who teach public school will love this segment that we're talking about? Like what are some techniques that you use to get people comfortable? Maybe say just with the French bass bow. Yeah,
again, I really wish I could show these things. But
we'll shoot a video and we'll include it.
I will do my best here just to talk it out. But I do what I call motorcycle bow.
Okay.
And I have everyone visualize being on the interstate, and you see those people go by on a chopper, you know, and the handlebars are real high,
right?
You know, and they got their hands up, you know, like sort of above their head, and the handlebars are way up. I always thought it actually looked a little silly, but it's cool. Whatever, it's great. And so I think what helps is when people do that, I have them hold the bow as if it were the handlebars on a chopper, you know, and just hold it as you would hold the handlebars on a bicycle or whatever, and then drop that whole thing onto the bridge.
Okay.
Or onto the strings near the bridge.
Right.
And what I find is that in the right hand, you know, Paul Ellison's class yesterday was amazing. We're at ISB right now.
Right.
And he talked about how your hands should look like your hands when you play the bass.
Yeah, isn't that
great?
great?
Be all jacked up or whatever. And so I love that thought. And so I think the handlebar thing really accomplishes that. You know, if you just imagine you're hanging on a bicycle or whatever, you've got that nice natural curve of the fingers over. Sometimes, you know, we're also at Ithaca right now. I like to do this kind of like peace and love analogy where there's like, you know, your arm is a waterfall. And the water comes down your arm and then just flows gently over your fingers. Nice. You know, that's a nice way to get that natural hand curve going. So I do that, and then you simply place the thumb, you know, where it should be, you know, I always tell people where the corner of the frog meets the stick.
Okay.
Is where I tell them to put their thumb. And really, if they do the handlebar thing and put the thumb there, usually that solves the bow grip.
Okay.
And what I tell them to do is for a while, I tell this to my bass majors too, French bow players anyway, to start up in that handlebar pose and then drop. And it solves two things. I think it solves that right hand grip issue, naturalness of it, but also it solves the like hanging arm, straight right arm, kind of on the strings of the bass. The weight is naturally there, and the elbow is not locked up. This is, of course, challenging dealing with different people, body types. You know, that is another challenge we deal with in that class. Is very small people sometimes, you know, not to say you can't be small and play the bass, but again, it's that first step.
Right. Just that overwhelming size of that compared to what you're used to, you know, like, It's intimidating no matter how you slice it, no matter how the bass is shaped.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, there's something about like a dude that's 6'4" and is a tuba major and it's just a bruiser. He'll just have an easier time than some other people.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's just a matter of being patient in that way. Left hand, of course, we have the issue of turning.
Right. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So how do you deal with that, or how do you kind of?
I always tell people to, you know, of course, you work for a college, you got to be careful what you say, but I think it's. I like to say you hold a soda can.
Yeah. You know. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And that again, it's the naturalness of the hand. I'm going to start saying that your hands should look like your hands. That's great.
A great line, and a gem from Paul.
That's right. Many. Yeah. But you know what I think? When you're on the bass, when you're on the neck, if there's no space between your inside of your palm or your palm, if between your palm and the side of the neck, that's not good. Yeah. You want to have that clearance, and you can tell too. Sometimes people shift on the bass, and you hear a squeak, and they're literally dragging their hand down the bass, and they're like, "Oh, it's so hard to shift." I'm like, "Well, yes, because you have all this friction." And so I think the soda can thing and ensuring that there's space. I've been sometimes I've used a small rosin container in here as a kind of a buffer just to get the feeling. I remember talking to Jeff Turner one time about teaching in general and learning in general, and the thought that we learn best through our kinesthetic systems, through the muscles. Sure. And remembering how something feels is much better than ever understanding I think in an academic way, just for retention. I mean, you got to have both. But to remember it, sometimes just feeling that rosin container in there, they'll be like, oh, okay, so that's what it should feel like, and then they go back to that.
Yeah, filling that space is really helpful for some reason.
Yeah.
I've seen that in action and being effective. Yeah.
Right.
What? So like the people that have never played a stringed instrument, do they start with violin methods before they get to bass, or is it depends probably, right?
Yeah, it depends.
Okay, so first time, here I am, I play French horn, here's this thing called a bow, here's this thing called a bass. Mm-hmm. Like, what are some of the things that people who've never played a stringed instrument in their life struggle with?
I think the first thing we do is we start pizzicato.
Okay, great.
I picked that up from one of my music ed colleagues, Rick Webb, great guy. I find that just simplifies things. But we work on the left hand for probably a good 2 weeks of the semester before we incorporate the bow. Because the bow is its own mess,
Sure.
At least in the first step. Left hand wise, there's a strength factor that's challenging. Right now, I'm excited because we're gonna buy some new basses at school. But we've had these old dogs, and they're not bad. They're really not bad, actually. I mean, compared to what I have seen, they're not bad. But for some folks that are perhaps not the most automatically strong in the hands, they have a really hard time, particularly holding down the E string.
Nothing like an old K for the methods classes. I used to teach that class at DePaul. Yeah. And we had some basses that are like, they should have been thrown in Lake Michigan long ago.
Right. Yeah, for us it's Lake Erie, but either way. So I mean, that's a real thing. And I'm very thankful to my institution because we will have, after this purchase, we will have 5 Shen 80s.
Oh, beautiful.
That are right out of Paul Strelow's shop in Fairport and just beautifully set up and ready to rock. Nice Diodario Prelude strings. Yeah. Comfy, no problem. But for right now, we're dealing with these big guys, and that is, I think, probably the toughest thing on people is the left hand strength. I'll tell you another thing that I find challenging, and I'm exploring this idea of maybe changing this in the future, but I'm a sitting player. And for most students, not all, but for most students I've worked with, sitting is been what I've recommended and what I've seen to work better. Again, not the only way to do it, just for me and for what my students have, in my experience. But I teach the methods class to stand. Okay. And I do that because I find that in the people I know that teach public school, in the classrooms I've been into, visiting, things like that, the stool factor is really... you never know, Right. And if you have a stool, it could be the wrong height, and there's nothing worse than the wrong height stool, And so I tell folks that, if you're starting kids out, I think standing is good. Now, there's some really, really committed, awesome public school teachers that get stools for all their kids and write to the parents and try to get this whole thing perfect. And even then, I'm sure it's not perfect because then you've got parents to do whatever. But and that's, to me, that's the best answer. Sure. But I'm not sure that everyone does that. So I think in the future I want to basically teach both. Yeah. And one of the students last semester had an idea to alternate. Have half the class sit one meeting and then stand the next meeting, which could be interesting. Yeah. Again, I worry a little bit about like another variable. I don't know. So I'm going to explore that. What were we talking about?
Just about what non-string players struggle with.
I find sitting down, the left hand is much easier for people because you have a little bit more strength. You can brace against your left knee. You brace the instrument, then you can really pull with your big muscles. And I try to get people to do that as best they can standing. And so I think avoiding the squeeze tendency is a big challenge for most of the beginners. You know?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, it's great to chat with you. You've been on my list for a long time. Like, Fredonia is great. Everybody should check out what's going on. You got the Bass Festival going. 2nd year now, right?
This will be the third
year coming up. Okay, cool. So I never have stock questions for this stuff. I just go chat. And a round 2 is always welcome. So anytime you got something coming up,
thank you, Jason.
Let me know. Hit me up. But I do have my one stock question, and this will be fun, probably just based on your background. So go back to 18-year-old Kieran. Violin, jazz, bass. Okay. Here you are teaching at Fredonia now. Yeah. Give some advice to your younger 18-year-old, let's just say, starting at Michigan self.
Oh, man. I would tell myself that sooner rather than later, to make sure your priorities are right. I think it's very easy in the world today, and particularly in the music world, to go after the job and let everything else be secondary. And I think some of the happiest musicians I know didn't do that.
Yeah.
Now, it's a balance, right? You can't go the other way either. But I really feel like committing to important things in your life, for me, family, personal relationships, other things, alongside the job search, that's what I would tell myself. I don't think that's the answer for everybody.
Right.
But I think that it's something that we need to remind ourselves about, because at the end of the day, at least for me, the job doesn't keep you warm at night.
Right.
And there's that whole thing, you know, and I think that as in a position now where I'm extremely grateful every day to have a job that I can count on, and have a principal position in a professional orchestra, and be subbing in some other wonderful places. I'm grateful for those things every day. And to have it now, I think even as I have it, that hasn't changed for me.
Right.
You know, I still really feel that side of things is extremely important. And I think there was some time where I wasn't thinking that way. I was just hammered down, and it's hard to know if I'd be here now if I hadn't been hammered down in that moment. It's a tough thing, right? You know, but I would just tell myself to be aware. I think is probably the way to boil it down.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think it's something people struggle with all the time, and delaying that, and we're kind of waiting for that moment, and you're putting your life on hold for years and years. That's great. That's great advice.
Yeah.
Hey, pleasure, man. Great chatting with you.
The pleasure is mine, Jason.
Cool.
Thank you.
Kieran, so good to catch up with you. Great sitting down and chatting in person. I can't wait to see what you continue to do here in the double bass community. Share this out, folks. I know that there's somebody that would love to hear about how Kieran teaches the bass, what he does with students who aren't bass players, teaching them some of these fundamental concepts, his whole career path, that he's found this successful, multifaceted career, starting off as a violin and jazz bass major. That's a fascinating path. Like he mentioned, only he and Kurt Moroki really have had that out of the hundreds of guests that I've chatted with. So share this episode. I'm sure that you got someone in your life that would love to hear it. And I would love to hear from you. Feedback@contrabassconversations.com will get you in touch with me. Let me know who else you'd like to hear on the show. Kieran has been suggested many times by guests. I'm hanging out in Ithaca. He walks by. Boom. There we go. Have a conversation with Kieran. That's how it works. But it's feedback that lets me know what people want to hear more of, who they'd like to hear from, and topics they'd like covered on the podcast. Thanks again for listening. Totally appreciate it. And we will be back again soon as we wrap up our coverage of ISB 2017. You can check all that out at contrabassconversations.com/ISB. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.